Greetings and welcome. A couple of months ago I made a promise that a number of the rocks that I found out in the field I would be bringing back, and I would be showing how to spot what I'm starting to call petrified organs. When I was first introduced to the theory of mud fossils, I was taken by it because the idea of paramineralization made a lot of sense to me. And the idea that things could fossilize a lot quicker than we were told also matched some of the different skepticisms and criticisms that I was hearing about the cornerstones of geology and different tools that we use for things like dating and whatnot. But I'm pulling away from the mud fossil term for these because I think that there's a better explanation than paramineralization for how these occurred. And I'll be going into that in the next video, talking about some different explanatory models for how that could have occurred. One of the things that bothered me when I first got into the whole mud fossil topic was that there were a lot of people that were pointing at screens, at nondescript rocks, and making claims that this is such and such. And I thought, okay, well, it might be possible, but there's a whole lot of certainty there. So I put out a request to the universe asking for a rock that was just undeniable, that had so many different specific anatomical features that for many it would be undeniable what they were finding. And a few days later, in a river bottom, I actually found a rock just like that. And I couldn't believe it when I found it. The first video that I did, called Mud Fossils, The Heart of the Matter, is all about this rock. It has 17 different very specific anatomical correlations, and I go inside and out of the rock. We'll be covering some of those different things today. That request was answered in spades, and since then that rock helped me to start to understand more about what I was seeing in the other rocks that were out there. One of the things that we're not really taught about rocks is that it's possible that they could be fossilized organs, and if they are, then they have specific anatomical correlations, which means that there's an up and there's a front. And so we'll be talking about that today. I'm going to be answering some of the questions that have been reoccurring over and over again in the comment threads of the videos, and even addressing some criticisms. One of the main criticisms is that I'm suffering from pareidolia, and that I'm looking up at a cloud and I'm seeing something, and so I just believe it is what I'm seeing because it looks that way. I've even been called some words like moron and idiot just for having the gall to question mainstream science. And it seems that these people are more religious fanatics believing in a doctrine than actually engaging in scientific method and going out and looking at what they're finding physically, finding empirical evidence, finding different things that they have questions about, and posing questions and testing those questions. So to me, that's what scientific method is all about, and that's how I've approached this. Another criticism would be confirmation bias, that I'm just cherry picking, that I've gone out into the field and I've found a bunch of rocks that match the shape that I'm looking for. But in the first couple of videos, I went out live and in the space of a very short amount of time found a number of rocks that were matching up with the theories that I had. So cherry picking is something that I have engaged in to a degree for this particular video, because one of the problems with hearts in particular is that there's a lot of different species of hearts and a lot of different shapes that those hearts can take. And then also upon death, the hearts go into contraction. So then you get a lot of different variants that you can find. And so some are more specific than others. Another question that I had is, why am I finding just hearts? And the answer to that question is, I'm not. Most of the rocks out there are of very nondescript shapes. So if we look at this stack over here, if I were to tell you that, oh, this one here, this is a spleen, you'd be like, okay, well, that dude is crazy, right? Or these are spleens, these are kidneys, unequivocally, right? It's got the kidney shape perhaps a little bit, and a little bit of an indentation there, right? Like you'd expect a kidney to have. But does that mean it's a kidney? I think people would call me a crackpot if I started saying that, oh, this is a giant spleen, right? So that's why I wanted something that was very, very specific, that I could look at and I could start to examine. So the interesting thing about the hearts is that they're very specific in the sense that they have lots of openings and they look a particular way. And we're going to be talking about that. So on death, the heart goes into contraction. It actually gets tight on death. It's not that it relaxes. So when it comes to odds, obviously the odds are very good of finding a rock that looks like a spleen, right? Or a kidney. But what are the odds of finding a rock that has 17 different anatomical correlations? So short of DNA tests, and I'm looking into that more about how to go about extracting DNA from these rocks, we're going to talk about different ways of defining certainty. And I've put together, in studying that rock over there, a long list of very specific coincidences could almost be used as a scale for determining the likelihood that a particular rock that you find is indeed a heart. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing I want to focus on is overall morphology. Now, hearts, like I said, can take a lot of different shapes, but if we look at this heart here, for example, or this one, or these two, you'll notice that they have this harp shape. They're kind of big on top, and then they narrow down to a point at the bottom. They also have very specific curves that reoccur, and we find them over and over again in a lot of these rocks. Now, those curves are explainable with the contraction, and as I mentioned before, the species of the animal or being that the heart came from would have a lot of bearing on the overall shape and morphology. I wanted to look for distinction. I didn't want to just make assumptions. So the rocks that I find that are most distinct, that exhibit the features of hearts, have this harp shape. And the reason I know that the up is up is because in addition to the harp shape, they also will generally have indentations on the top, which are the remains of the blood vessels. Sometimes they're very slight, but there's always a little something there. Oftentimes there is a flat portion. That's actually what's giving it the harp shape. And then when you look at the top of it, what you find is usually a little chunky quality, which has to do with the way the heart attaches into the body. So there will be the remains of blood vessels. You can find these little indentations. Sometimes you'll find actual openings. Sometimes it's just grayed out. And there's specific places which those are found. Sometimes the openings are larger and actually reveal chambers inside, which I've gone into with endoscopic cameras. But in general, to find these, in addition to the harp shape, what you'll find is that there's a front and a back. And the front will usually have multiple facets, like a gem. So a flatter area that's going one way, and then another, and then perhaps a third with that flattened area on top. There's a good example of what I'm talking about. Now, as the heart goes into contraction, it also gets a curvature to it. And you can see how the underside of this rock is curved, and it has that curved section right here, as a lot of these have. We'll come back to this one because it's very interesting. So you get the top portion. Now we're looking from the top, looking down. You can see the different indentations in a lot of these rocks, right? Here. The investitures and the remains of blood vessel openings. So as you look in, now we're looking into the thicker left ventricle. See when he pushes his thumb up against here, how it gets creased. And oftentimes the flatter rocks will show this. So instead of having clearly defined openings like this, you get these indentations that have this kind of creased look. Or sometimes what you get is just the hint of an indentation. So it's like a discoloring that you can sort of get the feel that there was once a blood vessel there, but there's no real trace of it except for a discoloring. And the more round the rock is, the more likely the blood vessels are to be open. But then the rock becomes less descript. And here you see the remains of what I believe is the aorta. So again, more of these indentations. So the rock will be smooth and then harp-shaped, oftentimes with a flat top. It doesn't have to be this way. I'm just showing you the easiest ways to spot them. So, you know, you'll find trillions of rocks out there that look like this, but to say it is something, you're going to have people looking at you pretty funny, right? So, flattened top, blood vessels, investitures, hints of blood vessels. So, in addition to larger blood vessels, you can also have external blood vessels, which we can see in a number of these rocks. Even the little ones have them. So you get the overall shape. On the side here are likely the pulmonary arteries, and that would be your aorta and vena cava. So it's scalable. Even the smaller rocks exhibit the same features. So you can see that shape is occurring. It's a very, very specific shape. So if we talk about odds, if I say, what are the odds of finding a rock like that? Well, the odds are, 1 to 1. But what are the odds of finding a rock that has this specific shape? Right? Now the odds are less. Well, what if I say, what are the odds of finding a rock that has this specific shape, but it's also got a flat portion on top, and it's got either openings or the remains of openings, and it's also got a curve? So with each distinct characteristic that I add, the odds get greater and greater that I'm going to find it. So blood vessels on top, on the sides, overall harp shape. Each one of those is a specific characteristic. Fleshy color is another characteristic. So if we look at this with water, as you get it wet, you can see it starts to have a very fleshy color to it. Many of the rocks are hardly noticeable when you look at them until they are wet, and then you can start to really see the remains of the blood vessels in them. That one just comes to life when it gets wet. Here's another example of a fleshy rock. And of course this one as well. It looks like meat. And this. So one of my theories is that one of the reasons that some of the rocks are fleshy and the others are not, it has to do with resets and the number of times the rocks have undergone the petrification process. So with each time, I think the rock becomes more nondescript. Blood vessels and other openings close up until only the hints of them remain or nothing at all. And that may explain why we have such a variety of different colors. As far as the question goes about other organs, also I've already talked about those, but these, for example, could be kidneys, they could be pancreases, they could be livers. They're very non-specific, so that's why I've really focused on the hearts, because those take such specific shapes. I believe this is lung tissue. If you know anything about the lungs, they have alveoli and they're primarily filled with air. Another thing about lungs is that they're far more likely to break into pieces because they're in different lobes. The lung will cleave at the site of the lobe. This just looks like a random round rock. But when you understand the structure of lungs and that the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 because of the indentation for the heart, those lobes are separated by fascia and they're going to cleave right at those lines that you see there. So you'll find far less descript shapes than compared to hearts, for example. Now I suppose somebody from mainstream geology would say, well, these are just fragments of rocks that have broken off. So the idea being that these have eroded by rolling around inside of river bottoms and due to rain and wind erosion, and that's why they have this overall shape. And I would just ask you to ponder whether this seems like a shape that would come about in such a random fashion. Especially when we start to get into these, where the larger rocks have very, very specific openings. This particular rock has the remains of what were the papillary muscles. Gone into that in detail in the first video called Mud Fossils, the Heart of the Matter. Gone in with an endoscopic camera and shown that there's actually the shape inside is not smooth as you expect from water erosion, but actually mirrors what is known as trabecular carne, which is the bumpy quality that the interior of the chambers of the heart have as a result of its structure. So this rock over here is very fascinating because this was found by my partner, and she and I were walking in the river bottom, and I just finished showing her how to spot these rocks, and she picked this one up and she said, "Is this one of them?" And as soon as I saw the shape, I knew instantly that it was. And then because it was it wasn't the prettiest I'd seen. Hold on, I gotta use my hands here. Yeah, so it's hard to do this, but basically you see the shape, you see the blood vessel there, and the remains of what was probably the aorta vena cava there. So she asked me if I wanted it, and I said, no, I don't need that one. So she tossed it on the ground, and it broke open. And when it broke open, I said, wait a minute here. Look at this. That looks exactly like trabecular carne. And you can see how red it is. And this is not a redness that has seeped in from openings so that there's, earth inside. This is the actual inside structure of the rock, which I'll wet a little bit so you can get a sense of it. So it has a very, very fleshy look to it, does it not? You can see the same openings here. This is called an isthmus between the two. I believe that these are the pulmonary artery openings. And then you have the aorta and the vena cava. So again, here's another rock with the chambers inside. You can see the remains of the valves and the papillary muscles in this one as well. Another one that I've gone into and that has the papillary muscle there. This particular rock is rather nondescript, but it's interesting because this and this and this are all interconnected by chambers. So you have that overall harp shape, though because it's so round, it's not so descript, but the particular locations of the holes and the fact that they're all interlinked makes it more interesting. So again, your harp shape, there's your aorta opening, your pulmonary arteries, and then just the overall shape of the rock matching what I've been talking about. Now, one of the things that's really important to understand is all of these rocks are contiguous. In other words, they're unbroken. They formed this way. They didn't break off of larger structures and then just smooth themselves out. And the reason we can know this is because as soon as they're fractured anywhere, they start to show very specific signs of fracture. And you can see that here in these two. See this one? There's your harp shape. There's your multifacets, your curve, the flattened underside, and then very obviously a chunk broken off of that one. Here, same thing, got your overall shape, and then this is broken off. You can see how obvious it is when it's been fractured. Here you can see the remains of the grain of the muscle and the trabecular carne on both of them. Okay, so by now you should be well familiar with this shape. I just want to show one thing. So anytime a stone fractures, it gets this jagged, broken look to it. This is nice and smooth. But if we turn it over, you can see here that the rock can't fracture without showing it. And it's almost revealing like an internal grain. So that is how they look when they've been broken. This one is particularly interesting because you can see the fracture, but it's got iron ore that's oozing out. So that's the remains of the red blood that was in the rock. This is really fascinating because here there's a fracture, and you can see that has actually exposed a chamber that is the ventricle. You've got the atriums and the ventricles, and the ventricles are the big parts of the chambers of the heart, and because of the fracture of that rock, you can see that it's been exposed. So this area holds more blood, this area has more contraction capability. And then if we look at this image here, you can see that this is very, very, very thick, and then here you have more space and a much thinner wall. So in the contraction of the muscle, this gets pushed out, and also anything pressing against is going to push in on that. I believe that's what's happened to this rock and the next rock, that they've been pressed up against something hard while they were still soft, and then they petrified, and it created this crease, this straight line. I found a number of rocks like that. You can see it here. I think that started when it was soft. In the next video, I'm going to be showing what these rocks look like when they're broken open. I've gone into the field and I've cracked open a bunch of them, and it's quite fascinating to see what you find inside. So one thing about the openings also that I haven't mentioned is that they can also pinch off, so you get these little like slits. The hints of the openings can be flattened. So again, I'm going to be, in the next video, I'm going to be showing what a lot of these hearts look like on the inside. And if you stay around for the last part of this video, I have a real treat, because take a look at this. So now that you recognize these structures, you'll probably recognize this. Look at the size of that. There's your pulmonary arteries with the chambers. You've got the harp shape. You've got that flattened top, and then you have your aorta opening right where you'd expect it to be. So if you stay around for the rest of this video, I'm going to show you a whole lot of these that were in the field that were too big to bring back. And you can tell me for yourself, what are the odds of finding so many rocks with so many specific features, all different sizes, so the whole breaking off because of molecular structure idea to me just doesn't work. If it was a particular kind of rock over and over again, fine, but when you're finding all kinds of different shades and types, depends on what it was that, that petrified them, what was surrounding them at the time, what kind of heart it was to begin with. A lot of factors involved, but I think the empirical evidence is mounting that that maybe mainstream geology has missed the idea that organs can petrify, and a lot of the rocks that we find on our beaches, in our river bottoms, a lot of those rocks are potentially organs. And you can see that these very, very specific shapes are repeating themselves over and over and over again. I can't get closer to that one. Here we go. I'll zoom in like that. Maybe that helps. As above, so below. There's a scalability, reproducibility. It makes sense. You've got animals of all kinds of different sizes and shapes. Birds, mice, rats, dogs, cats, cows, giants. How big was that, right? Our hearts, if you make a fist, that's about how big your heart is. It beats and pumps your whole life, so the softer you keep it, the better. Take care. So this is the beauty that I just showed you in my office, found in its natural habitat, both sides. And these are going to go from small to big. And hopefully you haven't jumped ahead without actually knowing the anatomy, because otherwise you might just think I'm crazy thinking that these were once the hearts of gigantic beings. But I'm pretty convinced. Found this one, which is already broken. You can see there. And then I turned it, and look at what it revealed. And it doesn't come out, but you can see if that piece was there that's broken off, which happened to reveal chambers inside the rock, that it would have that same shape as so many of the other ones. There's another beauty. I'll let you decide for yourself. Hey, is that an aorta down there? Perhaps. Whoops, almost fell down. Anyway, that's a big one, huh? See, once again, we've got the same cutout on the side with little holes there that would have been right where the openings for the blood vessels would be. If we turn it over, so that would be a cavity remaining from perhaps the ventricle. And then look at the top. Sorry, not so easy with one hand. I'll come in from this direction, and you can see, if I get out of the way, you can see the opening for the aorta and the breakaways for the investitures and some other blood vessels as well. And once again, the same harp shape. And that's a big one. What is that, 1.5 feet wide? Hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Share and tell your friends. Go looking for some of these yourself and see if you can find them. And the ones at the very end are the biggest I've found. But I'm also going to do a little what if at the very end. Notice none of these are broken, no fractures. And look at that. There's even a blood vessel up there on the right. And another equally as big, also with openings. So throughout this series, I've done my best to approach everything as scientifically as I could. But now, after having done that in both my Titan series and this series, I'm going to allow myself to let my imagination run wild. These are the sarsen stones of the stone circle in Avebury in England. And I just wonder if they might not have placed these. This is the largest megalithic stone circle in the world. It dwarfs Stonehenge. But I'm seeing a lot of the same kinds of shapes, and maybe they chose these rocks for a very specific reason. Those look a lot like pulmonary arteries to me, and you've got the harp shape there once again. And again there. Might just be my imagination running wild, but so if you look at this rock, the upper right hand corner, that would be the coronary artery. And I'm just wondering, as above, so below, maybe the Red Sea is a giant coronary artery of a great heart. We do talk about the heart of Africa. Maybe there's a reason for that. By the way, all those points that are plotted up there, those are all star forts. Shout out to Mike, 13th Monkey.